my house, my rules. If you don't like them, there's the door. That was how Massimo De Luca opened dinner on the last night his family would ever be the same, and every person at that long marble table understood it was not a suggestion. It was the most feared man in New York drawing a line on the floor and daring 20 of the most dangerous people alive to step over it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then a 5'4" single mother in a flour-dusted apron set down her napkin, stood up, and said the one word that no living soul had ever said to Massimo De Luca, and meant, "Okay, please do not modify it. Now I'll do better. Just, okay. As in, I'll take the door." She took her 7-year-old son by the hand, walked out of a townhouse worth more than most city blocks, and did not look back. And the man the entire underworld trembled in front of and sat frozen at the head of his own table, watching the front door close, realizing for the first time in his adult life that he had absolutely no idea what to do. To understand how a diner cook broke the king of New York, you have to go back 14 months to silence. There is a particular kind of silence that only money can buy, and Emma Carter had spent over a year learning to move through it without making a sound. The De Luca townhouse sat on a quiet block off Fifth Avenue, 4 floors of imported marble and old oil paintings. The kind of house where the front door weighed more than she did, and the men who guarded it never quite met her eyes. She had taken the job because it paid triple what any kitchen in Queens would, and because a single mother with a small boy and $1,100 in the bank does not get to be picky about whose checks she cashes. She cooked. She kept the kitchen spotless. She asked no questions, saw no faces, remembered no names. That was the arrangement, and for 14 months it had held. Emma knew what the De Lucas were. Everyone in New York knows the way you know the weather, not from anyone saying it out loud, but from the shape of the air. The suits that cost more than her rent, the black cars that idled at odd hours. The men called themselves associates and carried things under their jackets that she trained herself not to notice. Once, in her 2nd month, she had heard a sound from the study that she told herself was a chair falling over, and she had turned the faucet on full blast and scrubbed a clean pot until her hands ached, and she had never, ever asked. That was how you survived in a house like that. You made yourself into furniture. You cooked, you cleaned, you collected your envelope on Fridays, and you kept your head down so low you forgot you had a spine at all. Her son Leo was the only person in that house who never learned to bow, and thank God for it. He was 7, gap-toothed, obsessed with drawing airplanes on the backs of grocery receipts, and gloriously unbothered by the fact that the men around him ran half the vice in the city. To Leo, the enormous man at the head of the household was just Mr. Massimo, the one who once caught his ball on the stairs when it got away from him and handed it back without a single word, but with something almost like a smile hiding at the corner of his mouth. Massimo De Luca was 36 years old and sat at the top of the oldest crime family in New York, though no prosecutor had ever managed to make it stick to paper. He had inherited an empire built on fear the way other men inherit a wristwatch, quietly, completely, without ever seeming to think about it. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't have to. When Massimo walked into a room, grown men rearranged themselves around him like iron filings snapping toward a magnet, and the ones who didn't feel that pull tended not to be around very long. He had spent his whole life learning one lesson from his father and his father's father, that a man is only as safe as the number of people who are afraid of him. Fear was the family fortune. Fear was the roof over their heads. Fear, Massimo believed with his entire soul, was the only thing standing between De Lucas and the wolves. And the wolves were real. Their name was Ferrante. For 10 years, the De Lucas and the Ferrantes had kept an uneasy peace, the kind of peace that isn't really peace at all, but simply 2 rival empires deciding that open war would cost more than it was worth. They split the territory, They split the docks. They nodded at each other's funerals and weddings and hated each other in that particular intimate way that only near neighbors can. Massimo had spent his entire reign keeping that fragile arrangement from cracking because he knew what a real war looked like. He'd buried enough men from the last one to know it wasn't glory. It was just funerals in the rain and mothers who never smiled again. He kept the peace the only way he knew how. Tightly, coldly, with absolute control over everyone and everything under his roof. Which was exactly the problem, because Emma Carter had exactly one rule of her own, and it had nothing to do with him, and it could not be controlled. She had made the rule the night Leo's father walked out for good, when the boy was 3 and the apartment felt too big and too quiet. She had knelt down on the cheap linoleum, taken her son's small round face in both her hands, and made him a promise that was really a vow to herself. In this family, we tell the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's the one thing nobody can ever take from us. It wasn't much. It was honestly the only thing she owned that couldn't be repossessed, evicted, or laid off. A man had lied his way out of their lives, and Emma had decided in that kitchen that whatever else her boy grew up to be, he would never be a person who hid the truth to make his own life easier. In a house like the DeLucas, a house whose entire foundation was the sacred principle that you see nothing and you say nothing, one small, honest boy was a crack in the marble waiting to spread. The crack came on a Tuesday. Leo was drawing at the kitchen island while Emma broke down a chicken for stock. He was narrating to himself the way children do, and somewhere between the wings and the thighs, she realized she should be listening. And then the man in the grey coat got out of the black car, and Uncle Sal gave him the envelope, but he wasn't supposed to, because he looked at the windows first to make sure nobody was watching. But I was watching. I was on the steps waiting for you. Emma set the knife down very slowly. Baby, what man? Leo shrugged, still drawing, adding a propeller. Last week, when I was on the front steps, the one who talks quiet to Uncle Sal by the garage. She should have hushed him. Any woman with an ounce of self-preservation would have hushed him, would have wiped the whole thing off his mouth like a smudge of dirt and told him he'd imagined it. Salvatore De Luca, Massimo's uncle, the family's underboss, the man everyone in that house called Uncle Sal with a mixture of affection and caution, was not a name you attached to secret envelopes and grey coats and careful glances at the windows. Not out loud. Not ever. But Emma looked at her son, at his open, honest, upturned face, and she thought about the promise, and she heard herself say the only thing she knew how to say. If you saw something, and somebody asks you about it, you tell them the truth. You don't make things up, and you don't hide things. That's how we stay clean. Understand? I know, Mom, he said like she was being silly, and went back to his airplane. She had no idea what she had just done. She didn't know that Salvatore had been meeting for months with people he was forbidden to meet, taking money he had no right to take, from the one family the De Lucas had spent a decade holding at arm's length. She didn't know that the man in the grey coat was a Ferrante lieutenant. She didn't know that her son had witnessed the exact moment the peace of New York started quietly rotting from the inside. She only knew that in her house, seeing a thing and lying about it were not permitted, and she taught her boy the rule, the way she taught him to look both ways before crossing, as a matter of survival. 3 weeks later, it all came apart at the dinner table. It was a Sunday. The whole family gathered the way these families gather, even when half of them would happily bury the other half in the East River, and Massimo had called them together because he had finally learned the unbearable truth. Someone in his own house was talking to the Ferrantes. The Ferrantes had known about a shipment they shouldn't have known about. They had moved on a warehouse the same night the De Lucas did. Somebody was leaking, somebody close, somebody family, and Massimo, who could read a lie in a man's shoulders from across a room, could not for the life of him find the traitor. So he did the only thing his instincts allowed. He tightened his grip on everyone at once. He stood at the head of that long table with the candlelight catching the early grey at his temples, and he laid down the law to every single person under his roof. Cousins, capos, the driver, the housekeeper, the woman who cooked his meals, and her small son drawing quietly in the corner. My house, my rules. If you don't like them, there's the door, he said, and it was terrifying precisely because it was so calm. From tonight, no one in this family speaks to anyone outside these walls about anything they see here. No one asks questions. No one remembers faces. No one keeps friends I have not approved of. If any of you finds that too heavy to carry. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then you are free to go. Follow my rules or leave. 20 of the most dangerous people in New York sat like scolded schoolchildren. Salvatore, halfway down the table, nodded gravely, the very picture of a loyal uncle, and inside his chest his heart was slamming because he knew exactly who in that room had watched him in the garage 3 weeks ago. He knew, and he was already deciding what to do about it. And then Emma stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't make a speech. She was aware that her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against the tablecloth so no one would see. She looked at the man the whole city was afraid of, and she thought about a 3-year-old's face between her palms, and she said quietly, "I can't teach my son to unsee things. I've spent his whole life teaching him the opposite. So if that's the rule, then I think we'll go. Thank you for the work." You could have heard a candle flame flicker. Massimo De Luca had been threatened by federal prosecutors, shot at on the steps of a church, and betrayed more times than he could count on both hands, and not once in his entire adult life had a single human being simply told him no to his face and meant it all the way down. He looked at this woman, this cook, this nobody, this single mother whose name he was not entirely sure he'd ever learned, and the machine in his chest that always knew what to say next simply stopped. Emma took Leo's hand. She walked him up the marble stairs. She packed 2 suitcases and a backpack stuffed with airplane drawings, and while the candles burned down and no one at that table said a word, she carried her whole life down the stairs and out the front door. Leo, at the last second, stopped by the console table in the foyer, put down one of his drawings, an airplane flying over a tiny house, with a small stick figure waving from the roof. And then he was gone too. The great door closed behind them with a soft, final click, the loudest sound that House had heard in years. Massimo found the drawing an hour later, still sitting where a 7-year-old had left it. He didn't throw it away. He didn't know why he didn't throw it away. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, over his heart, and told himself it was nothing. Emma told herself it was over. They found a 5th-floor walk-up in Sunnyside, a narrow railroad apartment with a radiator that clanked like a trapped ghost, and a landlord who didn't ask where the cash deposit came from. Emma got a job at a diner on Queens Boulevard, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt and nobody bothers you, and slowly she started to breathe again. Leo enrolled in a real public school with a real playground, and a teacher named Miss Ruiz who taped his airplane drawings to the classroom wall. At night, Emma would lie awake listening to the 7 train rattle past the window and think, "This is enough. This is small, and it's ours, and it's clean." For a few weeks she almost believed it. But here is the thing about a house built on silence. When someone walks out of it telling the truth, the silence does not simply let them go. It comes looking. Because Salvatore De Luca had been in that dining room too, and Salvatore had watched the cook's boy the whole time she made her little speech about not teaching him to unsee things. He had watched, and his stomach had turned to ice because he understood something that Massimo, in his fury, had missed entirely. The boy hadn't just seen faces in the abstract. The boy had seen him, by the garage, taking the envelope. And now the one person alive who could put Salvatore's treason into simple, believable, childish words. Uncle Sal gave the grey coat man an envelope by the black car. Had just walked out the front door, beyond Massimo's protection, beyond the family's control, out into a city where anything could happen to anyone. Salvatore had a decade of stolen loyalty and a Ferrante alliance riding on his neck, and all of it hung by the thread of a truthful child. So he made a plan, and it was, he had to admit, a beautiful one. He would solve two problems with a single lie. First, he would make the leak disappear, quietly, permanently. An accident in a bad neighborhood, a single mother and her son. The kind of tragedy nobody in this city bothers to investigate. And second, he would give Massimo the traitor his nephew was so desperate to find. He would spend the coming weeks whispering gently, patiently, the way poison is best delivered. Have you thought about the cook, Massimo? She was in every room. She heard everything. She left the very night you tightened the rules. Awfully convenient, no? And now she's out there, unwatched, with everything she overheard. The leak didn't stop when she left, but maybe it went with her. Emma was gone. Emma couldn't defend herself. Emma was the perfect ghost to hang it all on. The first sign, the way these things always begin, was small. A man Emma didn't recognize, sitting in a parked sedan, across from the diner 2 mornings in a row, drinking a coffee he never seemed to finish, watching the door over the top of a newspaper he never seemed to turn. She told herself she was being paranoid. She'd spent 14 months around dangerous men. Of course she saw shadows now. Then, on a Wednesday, the lock on her apartment door was scratched and loose when she came home, though it had been fine that morning. She told herself the building was old. Then, on Friday, the school called. A man had come to the front office asking to sign Leo Carter out early, said he was a family friend and uncle. He was very polite, very well dressed. He knew Leo's full name, knew his teacher's name was Miss Ruiz, knew the boy liked to draw airplanes. When the office said they could only release a child to names on the approved list, the man smiled, apologized for the confusion, and left. The secretary had thought it was odd enough to call the mother. She'd thought the man's smile hadn't reached his eyes. Emma did not sleep that night. She sat on the floor of Leo's room with her back against his little bed and her phone gripped in both hands, and somewhere around 3 in the morning she finally let herself understand the thing she'd been running from all week. She had walked away from Massimo De Luca to keep her son clean. But in doing it, she had walked away from the only name in the entire city of New York that could keep her son safe. Whoever was hunting them now, and someone was hunting them, she no longer had the luxury of pretending otherwise, was betting on exactly one thing, that her pride was bigger than her fear, that she would rather run and hide with a scratched lock and a butter knife under her pillow than ever pick up the phone and admit she needed him. They had bet wrong. She picked up the phone. She still had the number. The private one, the one only a handful of people on Earth possessed, given to her once 14 months ago in case of a kitchen emergency, and never used. Her thumb hovered over it for a long time. Then she pressed it. Massimo answered on the second ring, at 3 in the morning, wide awake, his voice rough in a way she had never heard from him. As if he had been sitting in the dark for 14 months, waiting for exactly this call, and had given up hope it would ever come. "There's a man following us," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way she hated. "He tried to take Leo from his school. He knew everything about him, his teacher, the airplanes, and I don't know who he is, but he knew things he shouldn't. Where are you?" It wasn't a question. She could already hear him moving on the other end. Keys, a heavy door, the low, urgent murmur of men being pulled out of sleep and told to bring the cars around. "Sunnyside, but Massimo..." She squeezed her eyes shut and made herself say it. "I left. I walked out on you in front of your whole family. I don't have any right to call you and ask..." "Emma." He said her name like it cost him something to hold it steady. So he had learned it after all. I have had men looking for you for 14 months. I couldn't find you. I didn't even know which borough. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I have been trying to find someone who did not want to be found, and I could not. And now you are telling me somebody else found you first. Give me the address. I am already in the car. What Emma didn't know, what neither of them yet knew, was that the man outside her window did not work for the Ferrantes at all. He worked for Salvatore, and Salvatore had spent every one of those 14 months carefully, lovingly, building the lie that would end her. Half the family already believed the cook had been the leak. It was such a tidy story. She'd had access to everything. She'd fled the night the rules changed, and the leaks that continued after she left. Salvatore explained those too. She was still talking, wasn't she, out there in hiding, still selling what she'd heard. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, and it had exactly one weakness. It required Emma and her son to disappear before either of them could say a single word in their own defense. Salvatore had not counted on Massimo arriving at a fifth-floor walk-up in Sunnyside at 4 o'clock in the morning. He had not, above all, counted on Leo. Because when Massimo came through that door, coat still on, 3 men fanning out into the stairwell behind him, his face carved from cold stone and his eyes doing a fast professional sweep of every window and exit, the first living thing to reach him was a 7-year-old in dinosaur pajamas who had woken at the commotion and came stumbling out of his room and wrapped both arms around Massimo's leg like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I knew you'd come," Leo mumbled, half asleep, cheek pressed against the wool of the coat that still held his drawing in its inside pocket. "I told Mom you would. She said maybe not, but I knew." And Emma, standing in the doorway of that shabby little kitchen with a butter knife she'd forgotten she was holding, watched the most feared man in New York City go down on one knee on her cracked linoleum floor and gather her son against his chest like something breakable and precious and long lost. She watched the stone face come apart for exactly 3 seconds and then reassemble, harder than before. And she understood in that moment something that reordered her entire understanding of the last year of her life. The monster the whole city trembled in front of had, somewhere in 14 months of catching balls on the stairs, become the one man her boy trusted without a shred of doubt. They didn't have time for tenderness. "Someone tried to take him," Emma said, low and fast. "From the school. Knew his teacher, knew everything." Leo, still heavy-lidded against Massimo's shoulder, said it before she could finish. Simply, the way you'd report the weather. "The grey coat man, the one Uncle Sal gave the envelope to, by the black car, by the garage. That's the one who came to my school. I saw him through the window, same coat." Massimo went very, very still. For 14 months he had believed his uncle. For 14 months he had let Salvatore sit at his right hand and pour a patient, poisonous story into his ear about the cook who fled. And now, at 4 in the morning in a kitchen in Queens, a 7-year-old boy who had never in his life told a lie laid the whole truth on the table as plainly as setting down a spoon. Uncle Sal, the garage, the black car, the envelope, the grey coat. The same man, the same coat. And every piece Massimo had refused to look at for a year snapped into place at once. With a click he felt in his teeth. The leaks the family suffered after Emma left, that Salvatore blamed on Emma. Ferrantes, always one step ahead. The convenient, self-serving story that pointed away from the underboss and toward a woman who couldn't answer back. It had never been Emma protecting a secret. It had been Salvatore from the beginning, using her absence as a curtain to hide his own treason behind. And the one loose thread that could pull the whole thing apart, the single witness who could never be bribed, never be intimidated, never be persuaded to shade the truth because his mother had built him out of honesty from the ground up, was a little boy in dinosaur pajamas. That was why they'd come for Leo, not for what he might do. for the one thing he would always, without fail, do: tell the truth. Massimo rose to his full height slowly, and Emma saw something cross his face that frightened her more than any threat ever had. Not rage she could have understood. This was worse. This was a terrible, quiet, final clarity. The look of a man who has just discovered that the knife in his back has been held all along by his own blood. "Get your things," he said very softly, and it was somehow gentler and more dangerous than any shout. "Both of you. You're not staying here another minute." They were down the stairs and into the second car before the sky started to grey. And it was a good thing, because the man in the grey coat and two others came up those stairs 11 minutes after the taillights turned the corner and found a fifth-floor apartment with the radiator still clanking and nobody home. What passed between the DeLuca men, waiting in the dark of that stairwell, and the three who came looking for a mother and child, Emma never learned and never asked. She had gotten very good over 14 months at not asking. She only knew that the man in the grey coat was never seen in New York again. What happened inside the DeLuca family in the weeks that followed never reached a single newspaper, and it never will. Emma saw only the edges of it. The way the men who had guarded that townhouse were quietly replaced one by one with new faces. The way Salvatore's name simply stopped being spoken. The way a word gets struck from a language until the children forget it ever existed. The way Massimo came to the safe house one grey dawn, looking a decade older and strangely hollow, like a man who had been forced to cut off his own arm to stop an infection spreading to his heart, and was only now, in the quiet, beginning to feel the missing weight of it. He never told her the details. She never asked for them. She had learned in that house that some silences are not cowardice. Some silences are a mercy you extend to someone you've come to care about. There was a night during those weeks when it nearly turned into the war Massimo had spent his whole life preventing. The Ferrantis, learning that their man inside had been burned, understood that the peace was cracking and moved to strike first. There was a long, sleepless stretch of days when the safe house had 4 men on every door, and Emma kept Leo away from the windows and taught him a card game to keep his hands busy and her own from shaking. She caught a glimpse in those days of the true cost of the crown Massimo wore. The phone calls at all hours, the names he read off a list with no expression at all, the weight of deciding who came home and who didn't. She saw for the first time that fear was not something Massimo used casually. It was something he carried every single day, the way she carried Leo. And she understood that a man can be gentle in a kitchen and terrible on a phone call, and that both of those men can be real, and both of them can love the same child. The peace held, barely. It held because Massimo in the end chose to bleed his own family rather than the whole city, and because the Ferrantis decided that a DeLuca who would burn his own uncle over a cook and her son was not a man they wanted to test in open war. What Emma understood only much later was that Massimo had let it be known, quietly through the right channels, that the woman and the child were his. Not his to control, his to protect. And in that world there was no more absolute form of safety than that, and no more absolute a form of confession. But here is the part that nobody saw coming, least of all Emma. Massimo did not ask her to come back to the townhouse. She had braced for it. The grand gesture, the marble, the offer to trade her clanking radiator for a chandelier, and her diner apron for a life behind those weighted doors. She had even rehearsed, lying awake, what she would say. Instead, 3 months after that 4 a.m. drive, on an ordinary Sunday, Massimo DeLuca showed up at the door of the small, safe apartment she'd moved into with a paper bag of groceries in his arm, and asked, almost shyly, if he might cook dinner. For once. Since, as he pointed out, he had eaten her food for 14 months and never once returned the favor, He was raised to pay his debts. He was, it turned out, a catastrophic cook. He burned the garlic to black in the first 4 minutes. He did not know that pasta water was supposed to be salted. He read a recipe off his phone with the grim concentration of a man defusing a bomb, and he still managed to nearly set a dish towel on fire. Leo laughed so hard he slid clean off his chair and onto the floor, and Massimo, the king of New York, the man whose name emptied rooms, looked genuinely, helplessly delighted to be the cause of it. And Emma, leaning in her own kitchen doorway, watching this enormous, dangerous, ruined, garlic-smelling man squint at a phone screen and ask her son whether the sauce was supposed to look like that, understood the thing he was too proud to say out loud. He hadn't come to bring her back into his world. He was trying, clumsily and terrifyingly, and with a burnt clove of garlic in his hand, to find a way into hers. He started taking things apart after that, slowly, quietly. The kind of quiet that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a man deciding, late but not too late, what kind of life he actually wanted to have. Over the next 2 years, he pulled the family out of half the businesses that had made its name a curse, the ugliest ones first, the ones that had always sat wrong even when he pretended they didn't. He took losses that stunned everyone who knew him. He turned an empire his father and grandfather had built on fear into something smaller, cleaner, quieter, harder to be ashamed of when a 7-year-old asked what you did for a living. People in the old world said he'd gone soft. People said a woman had unmanned him, that no DeLuca had ever let the family shrink instead of grow. Massimo let them say it. He had learned from a diner cook and her honest son the one thing his father never taught him, that the strongest thing a man can do is not the thing that makes grown men afraid. It's the thing that lets a child fall asleep with the bedroom door left open. Emma never did move back into that marble house. She and Massimo were married in a courthouse 2 years later with Leo as the only guest, the boy in a small suit he chose himself, and they bought a narrow brick house in Astoria with a real kitchen and a real yard and a garage that held nothing more sinister than a bicycle and a lawnmower. If there were sometimes men in a parked car down the block, watching the street with more attention than a neighborhood watch strictly requires, well, that was a silence Emma had long ago decided she could live with, in exchange for the ones that mattered. Leo grew up in that house. He grew up tall and honest and unafraid, and he never once stopped telling the truth, and it turned out to be the most valuable inheritance anyone in that family had ever received. Worth more than the docks, more than the townhouse, more than every fearful dollar the DeLucas had ever taken. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the 7 train is only a memory, Emma thinks about the woman she was at that long marble table, flour on her apron, heart slamming in her throat, hands pressed flat to the tablecloth so no one would see them shake, standing up to tell the most dangerous man in New York, no, not out of courage, she'd be the first to admit, but simply because she could not think of any other way to keep the one promise she'd made to a 3-year-old on a cold kitchen floor. She had thought in that moment that she was walking away from everything, that her one small, stubborn rule about telling the truth had just cost her a home, a paycheck, and any future worth the name. She had it exactly backwards. That rule, that unglamorous, inconvenient, bulletproof little promise, turned out to be the only thing in that entire house of secrets that could not be bought, bribed, or broken. It was the crack that let the light in. It put a traitor's treason into the mouth of a child, where no amount of money or fear could scrub it away. It saved her son from the grey-coated man on the stairs, and in the end, in the strangest way of all, it saved the very man she thought she was walking out on, because a boy who would not lie forced a king to finally open his eyes and look at the rot he'd spent 14 months refusing to see. Massimo DeLuca had built his whole life on the belief that a man is only as safe as the number of people who fear him. It took a woman with $1,100 and a promise she wouldn't break to teach him that the number that actually mattered was much smaller. It was the number of people who would tell you the truth, even when it cost them everything. The whole city had been afraid of Massimo De Luca. In the end, it took a single mother in a flour-dusted apron to show him that fear was never strength at all. Strength was standing up from a table full of dangerous men, taking your child by the hand and choosing the truth even when it looks, for a little while, like it's going to cost you the world. Because it never was going to cost her the world. It was the only thing that was ever going to save it.